start, although we may have a couple of people joining us as we get on. It's past 10 o'clock now, and let's go, Stacy.
Okay.
I'm going to introduce Stacy Young, who's on the staff at the Broadmead Retirement Community, which I think you all know is founded by Quakers, but does not have a majority of Quakers living at it. And neither does Friend's House actually anymore, but it's close to that at Friend's House. And Stacy's a specialist in a wide range of aging issues, and also runs a dementia care program and does education on dementia specifically. We're going to talk a little more broadly than that, but she'll help us understand how I think what I will say is how brains change and how we need to interact differently with people as that happens. Thank you, Stacy, and it's all yours now.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. I know it's a Saturday, and as we were just talking about all the complications of Zoom and everything else, so I do appreciate your time. Wanted to say hello to Arthur. So Arthur sat on our dementia work group as we created our work there at Broadmead and really started to look at the future of what dementia care looks like. So thank you, Arthur. It's really good to see you. I am very respectful of the Quaker process. So if we could start with a moment of silence, and then I'll go ahead and get started. Okay, thank you all. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I have some slides available, and I can also share these with the meeting if that would be helpful to have as kind of a reference afterwards. Do you all see my presentation?
Yes.
Meg, can you? Okay. Okay. So just a little bit about me, not a lot because I hate that part of any meeting, but I have been working in the field of aging and dementia care services for 20 years now. Most of my career being spent in dementia care. I've received my master's in gerontology. My passion is dementia care and just working with older adults, and a love for everything that I do with them. Mostly have worked in the CCRC model, as we were talking about earlier, as well as specific long-term care and assisted living around dementia care. I'm so happy to be with you today. Meg had really asked me to present, an overview really of the brain changes and challenges that happen as we age, recognizing not all of that is dementia related. In some cases we have just what happens to us in normal aging. I often joke at 44, I can feel some of the effects of that even. So we'll share some of that today, and then hopefully have some time for question and answers. I really feel like that's important when you talk about learning more about what you're experiencing. So I hope that we have time for that as well. So just listed out some objectives for us today. I think that always helps us to kind of gauge the meeting. Looking at the differences between normal aging, what's called mild cognitive impairment, and dementia. Again, don't want to get into the weeds with that because, I know that you all are not clinicians like we are, but it is helpful to understand why things happen to our brain and some of the changes that we'll see. Providing an overview of some of the main types of dementia and just the basic symptoms you would see. Because again, as we contact with our friends, we meet in our meetings. I know Meg shared that we're just trying to help connect with people better, understand why we see some of what we see. I think it's important to understand some of those things. Learn about some basic communication techniques that you all can use with friends, family, co-workers, colleagues, to help understand better how to connect with someone that's struggling in any way when it comes to some of those age-related declines or just memory changes that happen. And then, as I said, opening that time up for question and answers. So did you know that we all normally age, that our brains are aging from the minute that we are born? First our brains are developing, but then there comes a time where our brains are all aging and making changes, regardless of any type of status of developing dementia in the future. As we age, the individual experiences a slower recall sometimes of events, or it can take them longer to process events. We find things like if there's a lot of noise or a lot of disruption, that can make learning and taking in information even harder as we age. It's just the way our brains slow down, the way that our brains change. It can take longer to process the information going in. An example that I like to give is, especially for somebody with a true dementia diagnosis, it can take as much as 90 seconds to take the information in, the brain to process everything that they just heard, and to then respond to that information. So I'm not going to do this, but if I was teaching a class at Broadmead, what I would suggest is, if you have a timer at home, even on your microwave, whatever it might be, on your oven, set a 90-second timer and see how much that takes. We're in a fast-paced world, all of us, and 90 seconds is, people think it's a lot faster than it is. So we don't give credit to how long it can sometimes take for the brain to process the things that we experience. Usually in normal aging, somebody is able to continue to follow spoken and written instructions. So if somebody's starting to have a difficult time processing, let's say, verbal language, they usually can still readily follow spoken and written. And I know I see that just in cases of individuals that come to me and they're concerned about dementia care, or that they may be experiencing symptoms that are leading to that. You know, I will share information around types of learning as well. So I don't know about all of you, but I am a visual learner. I need to see what's in front of me and understand that better. And everybody learns differently, but especially in normal aging, sometimes verbal language can become more and more difficult because of that amount of time it takes to process. So therefore, following spoken and written instructions can sometimes be much easier. Difficulty concentrating, lots of distractions. We were joking about Zoom earlier, but there's so many benefits, but I do think that one of the things that happens is it's actually increasing to our distractions, whether you're looking at somebody else in one of the boxes, or, you're finding that things are going on in your screen everywhere. So as we age, we need fewer distractions, less noise in our environment, so we can make sure that we process the information coming in. So in a meeting, per se, if you were listening for the data that you need to process or the things that you need to understand in a meeting, you're going to need as little distractions as possible if you have older adults on your committees, because the older we get, the more distractions can play a role in helping us to not process things the way we once did. Usually in normal aging, the capacity to learn stays intact, but it might take longer for that information to absorb. So there's, not to get too nitty gritty, but there's two types of memory: short-term memory and long-term memory. And it's as we age that our short-term memories start to become more challenging, especially in a dementia. Short-term memories are remembering what just happened to us. And a little bit about that is that short-term memory is what feeds our long-term memory. So if we can't retain those short-term memories, then we're not going to settle those into our long-range memories. So for instance, in a meeting, if somebody's struggling with their short-term memory and you shared very important details about what's going on for friends, sometime later, a person is asking again about certain data. If they're struggling with their short-term memory, they may not have been able to retain the information in the same way that one of your other friends in the meeting was able to. And that might be something you would see. But it's really important to me as a dementia care provider to say that not everybody who is older develops dementia, and not all normal aging processes that result in some slowing down of memory processing means that someone has dementia. You'll hear me say assumptions are never a good thing when it comes to working with other people and communicating with other people. We don't know what their journey is. And we're going to talk a little bit about that today. That's why it's important to really listen to what the person's saying, see what they're experiencing, because normal aging does happen, and it doesn't mean that somebody has dementia. Mild cognitive impairment is kind of a next step. When I started in my career 20 years ago, this term didn't even exist. People didn't talk about mild cognitive impairment. But now what we know it to be is a person who's starting to have some problems with memory, language, or another type of cognitive ability, but it's not interfering in their day-to-day life. They're able to care for themselves in their home. Some people with mild cognitive impairment are living at home all by themselves and living quite well all by themselves. Dare I say it, there are people with mild cognitive impairment driving and doing okay with that. It affects slight changes in their memory. This is where you start to see forgetfulness, or I ran to the kitchen to get something, and just as quickly as I was on my way to the kitchen, I forgot what I was going to get. That alone doesn't mean you have mild cognitive impairment. I sometimes do that myself, but little slight changes in memory and forgetfulness that increases, that could be a mild cognitive impairment. 10 to 20% of people age 65 or older will have mild cognitive impairment. And then it's estimated year over year, 15% of that 10 to 20% will then go on to develop some level of dementia year over year. One of the biggest precursors to dementia is age. But again, it doesn't mean that somebody who is aging automatically is going to get dementia. I share the story quite frequently that our oldest resident at Broadmead is almost 105 years old. And short of that normal aging that I talked about on the last slide, she does not have dementia. She has a slowing brain that takes a lot longer to process, just as I'm sure you have some friends that you experience that with. They need a little bit more time to take information in. It doesn't mean that that's a dementia. Dementia, on the other hand, is actually classified as what's called a neurocognitive disorder. And where dementia comes into place is when it does start to affect your day-to-day life. It starts to affect challenges in actually completing the task, completing the responsibilities, completing the life skills that you once did. We all think about the memory piece. So what I share is that it's short-term memory first, and it's only in the very later stages that it can be long-term memory. Long-term memories we actually hold on to. And for all of you, something to consider is this may be if you interact with a friend that you think might have dementia or have a mild cognitive impairment even, they may be inclined to share stories from long ago. Whether it was the yearly meeting 20 years ago, they remember it vividly. They share stories about it. They talk about it quite frequently. They may talk about the way things used to be. We used to do it this way. Whereas they may not be able to talk about processes and systems or meetings you just had or interactions you just had because it's those short-term memories that are going to become impaired. The other thing that happens in dementia is a language change. And this is a lot of information, but it's important to know, for the reason that Meg asked me to come today, language can be greatly affected in dementia. And what we call it is expressive aphasia develops first, later followed by receptive aphasia. What to know about expressive aphasia is that it's that I can't express to you the way I once did in words and sentences what I need to convey to you. Not going to go too deep into that, but this is where you might see word finding difficulty, but on a regular basis, because we all have that sometimes. But on a regular basis, you start to see the person challenged to find the right words to share. They can't speak up. They can't formulate the sentence that they want to. What is really important to share with you all is that the person that is experiencing this, their brain is not necessarily telling their mouth the right thing, but their brain also isn't telling their mouth that they're not telling you what they intended to. So they can become increasingly frustrated because they think that they've conveyed the message they meant to convey to you. But if you can't understand and you're struggling to communicate with them, that can be increasingly frustrating for them because they think they've just told you what they need from you or what they desire from you. And if you can't understand that, that's going to be frustrating for them. Not that it isn't also frustrating for the receiver, but you can imagine what they're going through in that moment. It's only in the very later stages of the disease, if at all, that you get what's called a receptive aphasia, which means you don't understand what someone's saying to you. And this is important for me to say, because I think sometimes as somebody goes through a memory challenge or a brain change, we assume maybe that people can't understand, and especially if they're having word finding difficulty or if they're not presenting themselves verbally the way we would anticipate, it can be really easy to assume they're also not understanding us. And that's not necessarily the case. Oftentimes in those early to middle stages, they can't tell us what they need to, but they understand everything we're saying. So it's really important to understand that in communication. Learning ability can become impaired if you don't have short-term memory, or if it's impaired, your ability to learn new things is greatly going to be impaired as well. So for instance, trying to tie it exactly to your group, if you had a board meeting and you assigned somebody a new position that they had never experienced before, if they're experiencing memory challenges, their ability to retain the rules and procedures of that new position are going to be really challenging. And even if it's a position that they've done the last 2 years, if it's a newer position to them, they're going to struggle because they're going to retain that longer term information, but not that short term information. Judgment. I like to do a lot of hand motions to help you remember. Our frontal lobe controls our judgment and impulse control. It kind of tells us the right way and the wrong way to act. With certain types of dementia, judgment becomes impaired. And with that judgment impairment comes all kinds of behaviors that you might see that may be related to those brain changes. It's really important for me to share that. If you see somebody acting not like themselves, making rash decisions, impulse decisions, that may be an impairment of that frontal lobe. The language I talked about is on your left temporal lobe, just so you're aware. So I say all of this because Meg asked me to talk about brain changes. And what we need to understand is dementia, mild cognitive impairment, and even normal aging, it's all brain changes. You know, we understand in our society that high blood pressure is a heart change. We understand that diabetes is a change with insulin in our body. Dementia sometimes is just looked at like this horrific disease and, you know, oh my goodness. But it's a brain change. So just like any other disease, it's a part of our body that's just not working like it should. But that doesn't mean that those changes mean that I don't have a lot to still give. So understanding the parts of the brain where it's affected helps us to understand why is something happening and what can we do to help that person. And then orientation, if you all understand what that means, orientation is just that, our orientation to self, our orientation to others, our orientation to time, place. This may be where you start to see somebody show up for meetings at the wrong time or not show up at all or show up the next day. You know, you might start to see somebody not dressing appropriately for the season, or somebody who might, if somebody had a true full-blown dementia, they may get up in the middle of the night, it's 3 a.m., but they think it's 3 p.m. They go out in the wintertime dressed for summer. These types of things. It's orientation to understanding your surroundings. So there are specific diseases that cause dementia. Among them is Alzheimer's disease. It's the one that everybody thinks about. It accounts for about 2/3 of cases of all dementia, but it is not the only cause. I try to hone in on that as well. Because you're gonna maybe come in contact with family, friends, individuals in your life who may have dementia symptoms, but they look really different than what you thought you heard Alzheimer's sounded like. And that's because different dementias affect us in different ways. So it's really important to know that Alzheimer's is just one kind. It's the most prominent, but it's not the only one. So what are some complicating factors? And I really wanted to hone on this quickly. So there is such a thing as reversible dementias. Not all dementias are reversible, but there is such a thing. Things like medication interactions that go poorly can make somebody look like they have a dementia. Even hypothyroidism or hyperthyroidism in an older adult that goes untreated and is severe could actually present looking like a dementia. Things like congestive heart failure, where your blood isn't pumping and oxygen isn't getting to all parts of your brain and your body, could develop and look like a dementia. There's another type called normal pressure hydrocephalus. Very quick, it's water on the brain. That's a reversible dementia if we can treat it quick enough. Why I say this to you is, if you have a friend that's struggling, encourage them to go and talk to their doctor. People don't want to talk about dementia. You know, if we had high blood pressure, we'd be sure to go to the doctor and try to get that under control, because we know what damage would be done if we didn't. You know, if we were starting to struggle with diabetes, we wouldn't be able to avoid going to the doctor if we were unstable, because if not, we know what the consequences would be. I would encourage that you encourage friends to see their clinician and to talk about what they're experiencing, because they can rule out these reversible conditions that can help make their memory challenges look much better than maybe they were, or eliminate them altogether. Depression and delirium on this slide, we often call those the 3Ds, meaning you can have all three, but one can make the other look worse, or one can make you look like you have the other. Delirium very much looks like dementia, The difference is delirium comes on quickly, dementia progresses over time. Depression, especially lifelong depression, and my friends, I can share that your counterparts, your peers, you in general, not to label, but in general, you come from a generation where mental health often wasn't spoken about like it is today. And so the challenge is we have many older adults who have never sought the treatment for lifelong depression. And that depression, as they age, and even in normal aging changes, can make them look like their memory challenges are far worse than they are. Same thing with anxiety. And as older adults, sometimes we take many medications. Any medications that we take, and the more we take, they can counteract with each other. And again, that can make somebody present with challenging behaviors and difficulties. Why I shared this slide is not only encouraging friends to seek attention and not to be afraid of a memory challenge that they're facing, but I say it in the sense of we don't know what's going on. And in some of these cases, we could help them, to get the help they need to live their best life. And with those medications, what I would say is if you see a friend that all of a sudden is struggling out of nowhere, maybe one of these reversible things is what's going on with them. And the quicker they get help, the better off they're going to be. So I always like to tell everybody to think of it this way, because I think it's a great way to remember it. Dementia is kind of like an umbrella. So dementia is the umbrella term for the loss of memory and other thinking abilities. It's these things underneath that are actually causing dementia. Because some people will tell you, oh, dementia, she has Alzheimer's then, right? Well, Alzheimer's is that one type, but not the only type. There's other kinds like Lewy body dementia, which looks a lot like Parkinson's disease, but also has as a hallmark severe hallucinations and delusions. And I share these not because I think that what you were interested in today is getting into the nitty gritty of understanding each type of dementia, but it's important to understand that there are different types and they affect our brain very differently. Vascular dementia would happen if people have mini strokes or strokes. The progression is a little different than other types of dementia. It's more of a stair-step decline. Somebody will be going along just fine. They have a stroke or a mini stroke and they fall down a level, and so on. If they have another stroke, another level. Whereas Alzheimer's and your other types are often on what I call a bell curve. So they slowly progress over time. Frontotemporal dementia actually hits people when they're younger, usually 40s, 50s, sometimes 60s. I told you what our frontal lobe does for us. It controls judgment and impulse control. Well, if that's damaged, you can understand the behaviors you might see from somebody experiencing that. And then certainly there's other types. Some people with Parkinson's go on to develop a dementia related to that. And then the difficult part, guys, is there can be mixed dementias, meaning if they did an autopsy on me, they could find that I had Alzheimer's and vascular dementia, or Alzheimer's and Lewy body dementia. So as you can see, the brain changes differently with each of these types. So that's just important to understand. So this is my warning slide. I am going to show a brain imaging slide, but before I showed it, I wanted to give a heads up because it's not a real brain, it's imaging, but just wanted to be sensitive. Is there anybody, if anybody is not okay with that, maybe I can let you know when that slide is done, but I think it's important for you to see because Meg really asked me to share about brain changes. And I think this slide will be very telling. So just wanted to give you a heads up. So you can see here the brain imaging of an Alzheimer's disease progression, starting with A all the way to F. Why I'm showing you this, everybody, is even in normal aging, I shared with you that over time, our brain can atrophy, it can change. But with every hole that you see progressing in these slides, that's parts of the brain that are being lost. And the reason I share that is because with each part of the brain that's lost is a function that our body used to do that's going to be done differently. Our brains have something called neuroplasticity, really exciting, fancy word. The idea behind that is our brains are able to overcompensate for changes that happen until it can't. So our brain will continue to compensate and compensate and compensate until the losses are so big that it just can't compensate anymore. And that means a loss of function or a change in function is bound to happen. if you all read a lot, you've probably read some really cool articles about somebody who's had a stroke on the right side of their body, and all of a sudden their left side is doing amazing things to compensate for it. Somebody who was right-handed has to learn how to do everything with their left hand, or, whatever it might be. So that's an example of neuroplasticity. But as the changes go along, you start to see the struggles that somebody has. And that's why I think I loved that Meg even said, let's talk about brain changes, because brain changes is exactly what it is. Our brain is changing, and with that comes just changes in the way we have to do things. For instance, in F, that top part of our brain, I would anticipate definitely that this person has Alzheimer's, because Alzheimer's typically affects the outer cortex of our brain. I would also expect that this person has some sensory challenges, because this central part of our brain controls sensory experiences of the world. So I could look at a brain, and our clinicians can now look at brains and say, I would anticipate you're going to struggle with this, or I would anticipate that you have Alzheimer's disease and you might start to see this. So we've come a really long way at looking at this imaging and then helping a person to live their best life, understanding some of the changes that have happened. So in the early stages of brain change or dementia, you might see memory loss and forgetfulness. This is your friend that says, what time's the meeting? Maybe for the meeting today, what time's the meeting? And then they forget again. Maybe they send another email or another message. I forgot what you said. What time is the meeting? Oh, that's right. It started at 10. Okay. What were we doing today? I can't remember. Oh, that's right. We were going to the park. What time are we doing that again? And it may be that they start to forget names of people that they don't know as well, things like that. Confusion and disorientation, starting to be disoriented to time or just confused about circumstances. We talked a little bit about the changes of the pandemic. That confusion could be even greater because the rules were constantly changing. So, example, confusion around wearing my mask into the store. I forget to do that, even though that's been a system for a while. I talked about poor judgment, language challenges. You can see personality changes in friends who start to experience some brain changes and loss. And I'll tell you, you see it one way or the other. You might see somebody start to withdraw. Maybe Meg is on a meeting and she says, I haven't seen Stacy in a while. Stacy hasn't been here for the last couple of meetings. I wonder what's going on with her. Well, it might be that Stacy's starting to understand that she has some of these losses, and her coping mechanism is to withdraw from the situation, because if you can't see me and you can't see what's happening to me, then you might think everything's okay. I don't want people to see that I'm not okay. The other thing, though, that might happen is they may become more critically dependent on others. This might be where people are asking for help more often, or they don't want to leave, or they feel fearful to be by themselves. They're asking for more and more help from individuals because they really feel like they need extra support. And then sometimes we just see where people become unlike themselves. And what I mean by that is somebody who was generally always really pleasant is all of a sudden becoming really angry and frustrated and presenting themselves very differently. Or somebody who was always very boisterous becomes kind of depressed and shuts into themselves. You will often see that in the early stages. And part of the reason, unfortunately, is because people understand that changes are happening to them, but they don't know what to do about it, and they're scared of it. I shared the statement earlier. If we have high blood pressure, we go to the doctors. If we think we're experiencing symptoms of diabetes, we go to the doctors. If we have a major cut that needs stitches, we go to the doctors. But the cut that is brain change, people tend to be fearful of, and they want to sweep under the rug. And we think in the industry, it's largely because there is no cure right now for Alzheimer's and dementia. So it's scary. It's scary to think about what's next. But what I would share is there's a lot that clinicians can do to support and help somebody with any level of dementia or brain change to live a really good life. Actually, guys, going back to this, I always ask this question, and you can just shake your head for those I can see on my screen anyway. Is there still brains in this box? This sounds like a funny question. Are there still brains in these boxes?
Yes.
That's what I want you to focus on for your friends. The brain isn't going away. It's just working differently. And what we tend to do in our world at Broadmead. And what I would ask of you to do for your friends, your family who goes through this experience is to think about what they can do. What are their strengths? What are they able to do? Maximizing those strengths. So for instance, Meg was talking to me about as sometimes our friends are challenged to do, maybe they have a position on the board or a position within a meeting or, you know, a committee, whatever it might be. If they're struggling to do things that they used to do, is there another role that they can take on? So not necessarily having to remove them from that role, but is there something else they could do differently that they have strength in? You know, helping them to maximize their skill set as the losses happen. It can be real easy to focus on loss, but what I would always promote as a dementia care provider and as a person passionate about dementia care and brain change, I would always advocate to promote strength-based understanding versus losses, always. Thank you for letting me go back. In the middle stages, just being quite transparent with you, I think the middle stages are the hardest. You have individuals in front of you who really recognize that they can't do things the way they once did, and they can't control the world around them, and there's not much that they can do about it. We sometimes say that it's almost better when they start to go to the later stages in that regard, because they often forget what's happening to them and things can be kind of new experiences over and over. Whereas when they're stuck in that mindset of, oh, that's me, telling real stories, because I think these help. And I hope when we get to question and answers, if you all have real stories to share about a friend or something you've experienced so I can give some insight, I think that's the best way we learn. We have a friend right now with us who understands that her memory is very poor. And it's poor enough, and she was struggling enough with some of her activities of daily living that her husband couldn't care for her anymore. So she came into our assisted living. And she said to us the other day, it's because my memory is so bad that my husband and I can't live together anymore. This is all my fault. Life has changed and it's all my fault. It can be really challenging, you know, and we've just had to help guide her that, you know, they still have each other and they're still together and they still have each other for support. They're just living life a little differently now. But it's exciting to look forward to when he comes to visit every day. And it's excited to look forward those times they have together. But it's a difficult time for her right now because she understands enough to know what's happening to her. Mood swings, again, you could see why this happens. I shared with you earlier that if I have a loss in language, I can become very easily frustrated and have great mood swings because the people around me aren't able to receive information from me that I need. And therefore, I'm maybe not getting what I need from others because I can't convey what I need from them. This might be where you start to see time confusion, somebody, you know, wandering away unsafely at a time that they're not supposed to be, the middle of the night. My friends, this is why we see silver alerts on the roadways. It's, you know, whether it's time confusion or disorientation to their surroundings. This is why we see those. Socially dependent or withdrawal. I, you know, talked a lot about that, and restlessness. So what we talk about with restlessness is almost me trying to find something that makes sense in my brain changes. So oftentimes I can become antsy, I can become restless because nothing makes sense to me. And especially if losses have caused me to lose some of my life responsibilities, if you will. Let's say because I'm having brain changes, I no longer can serve on a committee that I once did. Or maybe I had to retire from a job that I was very passionate about, and that was what I did every day. Or maybe I can't do my hobbies anymore. That's going to cause a restlessness because I need something to engage in. I need that structure, that routine. That's very important as somebody experiences brain changes beyond just normal aging. And then it's only in the later stages that we start to see long-term memory. If at all, it's going to be impaired. It's at this time. A need for supervision of the person increases. Their vocabulary might become very limited, or they may become even nonverbal. When somebody becomes nonverbal, we need to really look at their body language and what they're telling us without being able to tell us. I promoted you all today because you're taking this class to detectives. This is what I say to our staff. You're now all detectives. You know, when you're helping an individual or a friend who might be experiencing some brain change, we almost have to become detectives. Like a detective, we have to look at what we see in the surroundings. We have to look at what we see with the person. We have to look at what they're telling us in their body language. You know, what they are able to say, if only certain words are coming out. For instance, if they said, I'm looking for the thing, you know, I go there to feel more comfortable. I'm looking for the thing, it's round. So if this was happening at Broadmead, we would maybe think the resident needs to use the restroom, but they may not have the language anymore to say that. So as detectives, we're finding that information from what they can tell us and what they are saying. And it's in the later stages that physical support might need to be needed as well. So how can I help? And this means how can you help? How can you all help? How can you communicate better with some friends that might be struggling or some family that might be struggling? What is it that we can do for an individual going through this journey? So listening and watching. Watching becomes really, really important. And listening with patients becomes really, really important too. And actually, sometimes if somebody's having word finding difficulty, you have to listen and then use that skill of repeating back to them what you heard. So if somebody came to me and said, I might say, okay, I understand you need to. What do you need to do? So I'm going to keep trying to probe to figure out what they might need. We have a resident that does this right now. I need to, the thing. I'm going to be in trouble if the thing doesn't happen. Okay, the thing, I understand. So there's something you need to do right now or it's going to be trouble. I understand. Well, in this person's case, we knew that she was a professor. And so oftentimes we've learned over time by understanding her that the thing is she thinks she needs to go to her department meeting. And so in her case, we have to kind of go off of what she thinks she needs to do, that she needs to go to that department meeting. And we've set up an environment where she can feel like she's met the need of the life she's living. Because what I mean by that is we have to jump into their reality. She hasn't been a professor for 20 years, but her short-term memory and even a little bit of her long-term memory doesn't help her to remember anymore that she's not a professor. She still thinks that she's actively working in her career. And if I said to her today, Mrs. Smith, you aren't a professor anymore, you've retired 20 years, she would debate me. And it's because her short-term memory isn't allowing her to remember there's been a 20-year span since she last worked in that university. And that's the difference between a couple words down, validation versus reality orientation. So my friends, you know, in the 80s and before, they used to practice something called reality orientation, meaning they would take somebody going through brain changes and try to force them back into today's reality. So for instance, if I went to Meg and said, you know, Meg, I'm looking for my father. Have you seen my father? I'm looking for my father. Well, let's say my father passed away. Meg would tell me he passed away. And what I can share with you is I would experience that like it happened for the very first time. And then whatever my reset in my brain changes is. So for many people, it can be as little as 10 minutes. So 10 minutes later, I've left Meg, I was distraught. Now I might go to Arthur and ask Arthur. And if Arthur tells me the same thing, can you imagine that experience of telling a person over and over and over again, this difficult news, you know, and they're not retaining it? Because what are they telling us by continuing to ask? They're not retaining that information. And so we're basically breaking their heart over and over and over again. So in the industry and in dementia care and brain change in general, not just industry-wide, but people-wide, we've encouraged what's called validation. You don't want to ignore what they're saying to you. Oh, you're looking for your father. Well, who are our father and our mother to us sometimes? They're that person that brings comfort and that person that helps us understand, especially if we're going back into a mindset of our younger years. So it may be that they're looking for comfort. Maybe they need to use the restroom, but they don't want to ask you. You know, maybe they're just looking for something that makes sense, and mom and dad make sense. And this world right now doesn't. So we're going to validate, oh, you're looking for your dad. Now, I also need to redirect because I may not be able to produce your father if that person has passed away. Maybe I'm saying, oh, you're looking for your dad. Do you look more like him or your mom? I can't remember. Well, what were you looking for him for again? And maybe they'll tell you, well, I was looking because I can't find my way home. Or I don't know what time dinner is, or whatever it might be. So we validate where they are, because if we keep trying to make them or force them into our reality, especially with a significant dementia, we're not going to be successful. Being patient. Meg, I might call you up 15 times to ask what time the meeting is. I'm telling you something by doing that. I'm telling you something. I'm telling you my memory is poor. I'm having some significant challenges. Some people will use skill sets in the beginning to protect them. And this is important for you all to think about as you go through normal aging. We start to make lists. I don't know if you all are already doing that. I do it. Jane's giving me the thumbs up. Start to make lists, because I can't, my mom does this. My mom's 77 years old. She makes lists everywhere. She comes and helps with my kids with virtual learning, and I find her list upstairs in my house, makes lists to try to retain that information. That's actually a great tool. And people, as they go through brain changes, will use these tools to try to help them. The other reason I said get help from clinicians is there's a beauty in something called speech therapy, speech pathology. Many people think of speech therapists as helping people with swallowing or helping little kids to talk when they have speech difficulties in the beginning of life. But a huge part of what speech therapists work on is memory challenges and brain changes. So another great reason to advocate for your friends to talk to their clinicians if they're struggling, or for you to talk to your clinicians, because things just like what I just said, writing things down, having support systems in place, visual systems that you can follow, leaving your keys in the same spot all the time to make sure you can find them. You know, I am challenged with finding the meeting time, writing it down in a certain spot that I always look, like on the refrigerator or on the front door, putting systems in place. But being patient on the other end, when our friend asked us 50 times, what time is the meeting? You know, maybe there's things we can help to do. For instance, I'm going to send you a reminder right before, you know, a half hour before the meeting. Don't worry, I'm going to remind you. Maybe reminding them, did you write it down? Where did you write it down? Do you look there often? You know, helping them also to guide with some of those tools. Being flexible. Understanding that maybe things won't happen the way they did with that person, that the relationship might be different, that their interaction with you or with the meeting or with a group might be different, being flexible enough to understand they may need something different from you, and that's okay. If it's doable within whatever your relationship is, being flexible, and then being creative. So I just gave a creative technique. If I keep calling Meg, asking her 15 times for the meeting, giving some creativity behind that of, I'm going to call you and remind you, or I'm going to send you an email if I know you look at your emails, because maybe that's better. It's visual. You see the email and you're like, oh yeah, that's right, I got to get on. A text, if they text, you know, whatever it might be, but being creative around our solutions for them. Not dissimilar to a meeting or a group that you might be meeting with, a committee. My friend's father had frontotemporal dementia he developed it at 62. In his work environment, he couldn't retire till 65. As he started struggling, God bless that workplace, they found creative ways to give him new jobs in the workspace so that they could help him get to his retirement age and support his family. What a beautiful company, because not everybody would do that. But they got really creative in that they knew he couldn't do the job that he was once tasked with doing. They also didn't want him to feel a sense of loss or failure if they just had him come sit in the office and do nothing, because that wasn't going to help him either. So creatively, they found things in the office that needed to be done that they could assign to him, and he was capable of doing with supervision to help guide him through that next step. So if you have somebody that's really engaged in a relationship that you participate in, committee, work group, family, you know, organization, giving them that opportunity to still be a part of something is just really, really important. Empathy. And what I mean by that is empathy, not sympathy. It's really important for me to say this. Just like any other disease. I mean, I think sympathy is good, but if we can empathize with what somebody's going through, if we could put ourselves in their shoes, the next time you experience somebody that you wonder or you think, oh my goodness, there's something going on here. You know, I noticed that my friend is very different. The first thing I would ask you is to take a breath. And even if you're struggling with that relationship, the communication, you're just not getting across what you need to because that person's struggling, I would ask you to put yourself in their shoes and to think about, well, what would that be like if that was me? What would I want? How would I want somebody to treat me? How would I want somebody to approach me? I often joke that I could teach you this class every Saturday for the rest of your life. I can't teach empathy. Empathy is just something we have or we don't. I think you probably all have it. But empathy is huge when it comes to working with our friends or communicating with our friends that have brain changes. being careful what you say or how you say it. So there's no other diagnosis, I feel like, than brain change and dementia that we start to define the person by. Example, I don't think you walk around saying, oh yeah, did you hear about Joan? She's that high blood pressure girl in the group. Or, hey, did you hear about Meg? Meg's that girl with the girl with the diabetes in the group. But there's a misnomer in society that we'll start to call people demented residents or that demented person. Well, what sounds better, that demented person or the person living with dementia? Because the person's still living. Remember that brain slide I showed you? There was still brain there, right? You all shook your head yes when I asked. The person's living with dementia. And yes, that dementia is causing symptoms that make life a little bit more difficult for them, but they are still living with dementia. So being careful what we say and how we say it is really, really, really important. What we call things, how we say things. One of my things that I hate the most is to say to somebody, you know, don't you remember? So if you know somebody struggling with memory challenges, you know, and let's say Meg, I didn't show up for the meeting and you call me up and you said, didn't you remember we have a meeting today? Well, if you know I'm struggling with memory challenges, didn't you remember is not going to help me, because no, I didn't. That's why I didn't show up for the meeting. You know, or let's say that I'm working on the Treasury and you know that I'm having memory challenges, you know, then the way that you're going to talk to me about that. And that's a huge question, you know. So when Meg presented kind of the needs of this group and the understanding of this group to me, there are things that sometimes as somebody progresses in a brain change, brain illness, we do sometimes have to draw a hard line and say the functioning we need for this position can't be fulfilled any longer if this is something somebody's struggling with. What I would suggest, though, is there an opportunity that you could let that person stay on, maybe with somebody else who kind of takes over, but they could give their valuable advice and feedback and support. Maybe they're not so heavily controlling the finances, because let's face it, that's a little scary. I just had this with a couple at Broadmead. The wife very much likes to write checks, but she's not safely writing checks anymore. So God bless her husband, what he did was he sits down with her and he lets her write their charitable giving checks, but they do it together. So she's still having that success of being able to write a check out because she really likes doing it. And she feels really good, especially about writing those charitable giving checks, because she feels like she's giving back, but he can monitor the safety of it. So that's just one example. I'm sure you have lots of different ones, but I share the Treasury one because that's a big one. So let's say and it doesn't have to be related to yearly meeting or friends. It could be in your household that you're starting to worry about your husband writing the checks or your husband caring for some of those high level skill sets. If you can, being creative and helping to help guide them through that, where you do it together, or you experience it together, or versus taking it away completely. Because my friends, if you have something that you love and I said to you today, you can't do it anymore because you have dementia and we don't trust you, how would that feel?
Okay.
It wouldn't feel good probably. So trying to help guide them along the journey and maybe make some changes to help them still be a part of it is huge. Routines and strengths are really important as somebody goes through brain changes. Routines almost become more important. So for example, Baltimore yearly meeting would meet in person, or, you know, just so Jane, I think I heard you're a member of Stony Run meeting, which is what many of my friends at Broadmead are a member of. So Stony Run met, and then, oh my goodness, boom, the pandemic hits. So let's say that I always followed a pattern every single week of coming to Stony Run meeting faithfully. This might be the person that the pandemic hits and Stony Run meeting shuts down. But if you drove by the meeting house, that person's standing out front waiting because their routines are key in their dementia journey. And you throw them off of that routine and there they are waiting at the door because they can't remember that. We just had it the other day, one of our balance classes got canceled, and somebody that's struggling but really follows that. Remember, I said the speech therapist is huge with this. She has set her up a whole calendar of her daily events Well, even though a message went out about cancellations, that calendar said to her she had a balance class. So she showed up at the door thinking that it was still happening. So routines become huge, but also my strengths become huge. So maybe I can't balance a checkbook anymore, but maybe I do a great job caring for the home still. I do a great job doing all the chores around the house, and I really get great success and feeling of success and positive energy out of that. So I should still be able to do that. Giving options and choices. Don't take my choices away. Give me options. Maybe you need to limit those options. You know, Meg, if you wanted to meet with, and Meg, I keep picking on you because you brought me along, but also you're the first person on my screen. So, you know, Meg, maybe if you know you have a friend in the meeting that that's struggling with their brain changes, you may not be able to say, well, what's good on your calendar? But maybe you can still give me that choice of, could you meet Tuesday or Thursday? What's better for you? Or would you rather meet at your house or mine? What's better for you? Oh, I should probably come to you, you know, that type of thing. So giving choices where we can, limiting options to meet the needs of that individual, but don't take those choices away. I say this even for my most impaired residents. My hope is that my staff are going up, let's say when it comes to dressing, and this is maybe not an example important to you, but it gives that example I'm trying to give. I want my staff to carry up 2 outfits and give me that choice, even if I am nonverbal and I can't say, you know, purple, but maybe I can point to the purple because that's my favorite shirt. It's always important. People with any type of brain changes should not have their choices taken away from them. What I always say is they should be involved in the conversation, and if they can't be, they shouldn't be present. Somebody who's going through brain changes, especially judgment issues, if they can't be a part of the conversation, please remove them from it and have that conversation offline. The reason being is, remember how I said that it's only in the very later stages of the disease that they might have what's called a receptive aphasia, where they don't understand what you're saying? What can quite frequently happen is people who experience brain changes, and especially if they become nonverbal, people will assume that they don't understand what's going on and maybe have conversations in front of them that can be confusing to them or that they think is about them. And that can be very distressing and very frustrating. So involve them as much as we possibly can, family member, friend, whatever it is, if they're going through these struggles. But if they truly can't engage in that conversation, then don't have them be a part of it. Ask for help. So this one is a little bit more in my thinking of if you have a true family member, you know, somebody you interact with every day that's going through this as caregivers, because that's what that would make you. Although we like the term care partner because you're in it together. You know, it's you and that other person in it together. But sometimes as a care partner, if we're helping somebody, we have to ask for help ourselves. We can't do it alone. And sometimes what I would say to you is if we become increasingly frustrated, and this can even speak to what Meg was sharing, is sometimes challenges on committees and things as people are struggling or not engaging in the same way. If you find that you're boiling over and you're hitting a wall when you're trying to deal with that person, maybe asking another person to help you with that situation that knows that person better or has a better relationship, or just that hasn't been dealing with it for the last 2 days or the last 3 weeks, you know, a new face to come into play. Or sometimes maybe going to that person's family and saying, this is what we're experiencing and I'm worried and I don't quite feel comfortable, you know, engaging in a conversation about that, but I thought I should let you know so that you can. That's important too. And then referring them, you know, so that's where I said, what can you all do to help? Well, referring them to seek help themselves, you know, asking if they've spoken with their clinicians, you know, if there is something that the meeting can do for them, you know, maybe a little support group, or maybe there's others in the group experiencing the same thing. We find the greatest value in connecting with people going through it just like you are. So, you know, if you have a friend that is going through a dementia journey, you know, and their spouse is really struggling, well, maybe there's somebody else that also is going through that same experience, and those two spouses can be there for each other because nobody knows it better than the people that are living through it. So referring out for resources like, you know, Broadmead has those resources. I know some of you are from the Friends community, resources there, but not being afraid to refer out or ask for help. And then, like I said, if you have to have those difficult conversations, so, you know, I keep going back to that treasury position, or like, I'm trying to think, like if the president was struggling, if the president, the clerk, was struggling, with the day-to-day functions of a committee that you're serving on. That may be a time for a frank conversation, but I would just say be as transparent with them as possible and try to be as kind and empathetic as possible as you approach those conversations. Because sometimes we do have to difficultly say, you can't do this anymore. I'll give you the real example at Broadmead. Probably the hardest thing we ever have to tell a person is that they can't drive anymore. That's probably the hardest thing we have to tell them. They don't want to hear it. It's a loss of independence. That's what it feels like. And sometimes the best thing we can do for a person is to be transparent and say, we have noticed, if it was driving, we have noticed that you were driving unsafely down York Road the opposite way. We've had to recommend you for your driver's license to be evaluated because we have to protect your safety. So Treasury being a benign example, but the checkbook the checkbook has to be balanced in a certain way. It has to be protected. So if that frank conversation would have to be had, for example, you would want to be transparent, open, honest, and kind, and just say, we have experienced this. We have noticed this. Put the facts in front of them. And like I said, whenever possible, if we can keep somebody engaged, but maybe in a different way, maybe they're mentoring the next person with their advice, but the next person's actually the one now monitoring the books. Or maybe we know that they also are a great note taker because they're taking notes all the time for themselves. So we have them take notes in a meeting, whatever it might be, but assigning other ways that people can be engaged and successful. Because what I share with everybody is with every loss with dementia, somebody's world becomes just a little bit smaller. And if we can make that world just a little bit brighter by adding value and success, because that's the thing, we all want to be successful. We all want to be communicated to like a human being and be successful and feel like that sense of accomplishment. And that doesn't change for somebody going through this journey. So that said, before we get into questions and answers, the most important thing I can tell you is any behavior you would see is what I would call communication. And what I would ask of you is, I would ask that instead of framing it as, oh, Jim acts that way because I heard he has dementia. No, Jim may act that way in spite of his dementia because he can't communicate to you why he's acting that way. But Jim is likely acting that way because behavior is communication, especially for somebody going through brain change. Is it to know that person in pain, physical or mental? Is that person wondering, why can't I do this the way I am? Because I assure you, if you're noticing changes in the individual, they're probably noticing it themselves. Does that make sense? If you're noticing it, they very likely might be noticing it themselves, but it's hard to give up on things. They're frustrated, they feel confused, or maybe they just feel like the person they're engaging with is talking way too fast. So something to tell you, in the earliest stages of brain changes, people can lose as much as 1 in 6 words. Well, if we slow down, and I have to tell you, one of the things I love the most about the Quaker process is the thoughtfulness. So I think that you all lend yourselves to practicing this skill set anyway, the thoughtfulness and taking your time, taking it slow. I'm going to admit I'm a fast-paced person, and Arthur in the work group, when I first started at Broadmead, would challenge me that I needed to move a little bit slower. And I know that in dementia care, but I tend to be like let's go. But sometimes we have to take a slower pace. We have to slow down, explain thoroughly, maybe explain again, not go so fast, because 1 in 6 words, as long as you talk to me slowly, as long as we have a gentle conversation, I'm probably going to get the gist of what you're saying. In the later stages of brain change and dementia, people can lose as much as 1 in 2 words. So even if you're going slow, even if you're trying to do simple commands or simple instructions to somebody, 1 in 2 words is a lot, everybody. And if you lose 1 in 2 words, your ability to convey and to accept human language is just in a different place. I often equate it to the Charlie Brown teacher, if you've ever heard her, that wah, 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 that's what it can sound like. And then you can imagine where somebody might be resistive because they may not understand what you said to begin with. That can be really challenging, 1 in 2 words. And then eventually people can sometimes become nonverbal and aren't even able to convey words. So just all things to consider. I would say behavior may be the only reason it's because of dementia is because I can't communicate in other ways, but it's not due to dementia. The behavior is due to I can't live my world the way I once did. And so my behavior is showing you what I need because I can't show you in words. I would equate it to your babies. If you all have babies or babies in your family, and I'm not suggesting that older adults living this journey are babies. What I'm saying is when our babies are little and they can't convey in human language, what do? They cry or they call out. And what do? We problem solve because we have to try to figure out what they need. What I would say is usually behavior for somebody going through brain changes is an unmet need that they're trying to convey to you in the only way that they can. So that said, this leaves us, I think, about 25 minutes, a little less for questions. I really wanted to be thoughtful to give some time of what you're experiencing and what I might be able to try to lend some advice for, or if you have questions from what I presented.
So Stacy, why don't you stop sharing your screen?
Okay.
And then we'll be able to see all the people,
Yes.
and that will help. So John Overvelt, why don't you go first?
Thank you. That was super, Stacy.
Thanks, John.
You're a real pro.
John, I think you might be my attendee from the furthest place before. I love it.
That's right. Thank you. That was really excellent. One quick one is you were talking about mental neurological changes. Are there physical changes? I know as we age, like I age, and I'm not too demented, but my balance isn't as good as it should be, and some coordination difficulties, and I have to consciously be careful when it's dark to consciously work on reducing the risks and things like this. And also I get tired more quickly.
Yes.
Now, with dementia, Alzheimer's or the others, are there any, does it always go with any physical function changes? Or do they happen to be just in parallel? Or are they accelerated by dementia?
That's a great question. So what I would say is they don't always come with it. It depends on the type of dementia and also the stage, because typically the physical mobility changes you would see in dementia itself would be in the later stages of the disease. But similar to what you just said, they can go in tandem because let's face it, somebody who's experiencing a dementia could also have other physical comorbidities that are in play too. If you're having balance issues, John, sometimes in our deeper part of our brain, it's actually the same area that affects things like Parkinson's disease. Sometimes if there's just changes going on in the deeper part of the brain, that can affect our balance, our mobility. Some of it can be tied to your other sensory systems, meaning if you're starting to have more visual difficulties, that also affects our balance. If you're starting to have more issues with your hearing, that also affects our balance. We take for granted that we think balance is all about our legs, but it's a lot about how our nervous system works together. So they can go in tandem, but in dementia, yes, as people progress, eventually you will see motor loss and motor capabilities change because as the damage progresses in their brain, it starts to move into their motor center. The motor strip is right here. And then, like I said, deeper involved is a lot of the more intricate balance, gait, things like that, but not typically.
Can I ask one last quick one? I'm sorry to be greedy, but
no, that's okay.
With COVID, I don't know if any of your residents have come back out of hospital or have been isolated with COVID and also have dementia. Are there particular issues around that, or have you heard of issues related to that? And also on vaccination, are you able, even with advanced dementia or Alzheimer's, are you still able to vaccinate, or is that things like that tricky?
That's a great question. So what I would share is we certainly had We count ourselves lucky at Broadmead. We haven't had a resident case since August. We haven't had a symptomatic resident case since July. And we did have several of our pretty significantly persons living with dementia that went into isolation at one point or another because of dementia or just because of exposure. And we certainly did see the effects that it took long term. I would actually say that about our older adults in general in our community, but especially for those living with dementia, it's almost like we've seen them drop another level this year that maybe if COVID didn't exist, we wouldn't have seen. Because like I said, Alzheimer's and dementias usually are progressive. You're not just going to take this hefty drop in a day. But because of isolation, lack of engagement at points, there was points where I also oversee the activities department at Broadmead. There was times we couldn't do group activities. There was a period of maybe 4 months or 5 months, we couldn't do a single group activity. People were in their rooms, and we've seen their mobility change because of that. We've seen their cognitive change because of that. We often say it's the unexplained or unjustified toll that COVID has taken on our society that's much greater than the virus itself. So yes, John, we've seen people that came out of isolation, and it's almost like we saw them drop a whole nother level. We have one lady, some of them have bounced back, but we have one lady that we feel like everything changed once she went into isolation. We have not seen the same side of her since. In reference to your question about vaccination, I love this. I'm pleased to share we're at 100% vaccinated on our long-term residents, including our residents living in our memory care center. It wasn't easy. I would actually say that we didn't worry about what the vaccination would do symptomatically because we kind of understood what that looked like for all of us. The difficulty in trying to provide the vaccination was what was difficult. And thankfully CVS, which was our partner, we partnered with them to have our nurse go in that person felt comfortable with to try to ease that situation as best we can. That they're used to giving their medical procedures. So I'm pleased to say we were able to do it, but it didn't come without its toll. We had at least one resident cuss out the CVS pharmacist, but they got their vaccination. So that's a great question because you wonder, with people with significant dementia, are they able to, just like with people with disabilities? I've heard some really unique things of vaccination clinics for people with disabilities to better handle that so that we can make sure we keep them safe. Thank you for all those questions. They were all good ones.
So let's move back to the kinds of questions that we have about some of our experiences. And Peggy Dyson-Cobb, you're the first one I see.
Well, one of the things that I just wanted to mention is when you were talking about losing one word in 6 at certain stages, and then it could get worse than that. I just wanted to remind friends that many of us, me included, are wearing hearing aids, and we miss one word in 6 anyway. And there's not, as far as I know, there's not a significant brain change, but that can really make the whole thing about communicating incredibly much more difficult. So slowing down and making sure that you're speaking loud enough but not yelling can be really helpful.
And Peggy, it's also made me aware that we actually, as Quakers, have a problem with the way we do our work because it is only verbal, and we very seldom use visual. And some people do, a lot of people, turns out, actually think visually. So we need to be thinking about how a lot of things. But I won't talk. Let's have some more questions. I saw Barb Platt's hand.
Hi, Stacy, that was awesome. And I have 2 specific questions, but I just want to say as a parent of a young adult who's autistic and had learning disabilities, I've been part of both those communities for a long time, and I'm stunned by the overlap in everything from behaviors communication. That was always a mantra, to you maximize the strengths, you work around the disability. I mean, all that's just fascinating to me. The 2 questions are when someone's lost the expressive aphasia and they can't find the words, can they be more successful if they write, which again is the visual? That's one question. Then the other is if you could say a little bit more about hearing loss, and having been wearing hearing aids for a long time now, I know when I'm not hearing well, if I'm not wearing my hearing aids, all the processing changes. My ability to relate, many things change when I can't hear well. So those are the 2 questions.
I love that. Yes, I agree with you. There's such a similarity. And then about the expressive aphasia, absolutely. We often find if you can't convey what you need to in words, that writing it down next is the best way. Even if somebody doesn't have a hearing impairment, we'll sometimes use a whiteboard just to have on hand to do that, or to type it out. Like, we have so much technology now that if you can type it out on an iPad or something and then convey that message, I think that's huge, because we do often find in the later stages, sometimes written words can be hard too. But in the earlier stages, as I'm starting to struggle with verbal language, absolutely, written language tends to stay more intact. So that's a great resource. And I love what Peggy said. If I was giving a longer talk, I actually talk about hearing, but I was trying to be sensitive to time today because hearing is huge. My mom has complete hearing loss on her right side of her right ear, and it's nerve damage. So even a hearing aid's not going to support it. And what she's quite frequently shared with me as well is that she's only going to ask you maybe to repeat yourself, maybe once, maybe twice at most. It's just uncomfortable. And so what can happen is you might think that she's fully engaged in the conversation. She's not going to ask you to repeat anymore, but then she didn't hear anything. And then come later, she then is asking or acting as though that conversation never occurred. And so could that look like memory loss or brain change? Absolutely. But it actually was sensory because she never inputted the information to begin with. To Barb's point, if I'm processing differently, it may not be about dementia. Peggy said, as far as I know, I don't have any concerns, and that very well could be the case. Same thing with vision. I have a resident who has significant macular degeneration and can't see forward at all. He only sees the periphery. So think about how our vision helps us accept our environment and understand our world. So if I have that significant vision loss, it could look like I have a dementia as well, but it might be sheer processing. So Barb, absolutely. I hope that answered your question or helped further clarify, but that could very much look like a memory challenge. That might not be. It might be that my sensory needs aren't being met adequately.
Jenny Sherwin.
Stacy, thank you so much for your very comprehensive overview. So I've been, and I love your term, I've been a care partner for going on 6 years now. And lately I've run into this phenomenon that I don't know how to find an explanation for, and I've read a lot on memory loss. So what's been happening lately is that, we get publications that come in every week. And very often my husband will say, I don't understand why we keep getting the same publication over and over and over. And I said, well, what do you mean? But they're different ones that are coming in, but he looks at them and he says, well, I've already read this. Why do I want to read it again? Maybe we should cancel the subscription. Mm-hmm. Can you explain that phenomenon?
So likely what he's probably identifying, let's say National Geographic, I'm just making that up as an example. National Geographic has such a telling cover, right? Regardless of what the image is on the cover, that big National Geographic, the yellow border, it may be that as his cognitive decline is increasing, the only thing he's identifying with on there is the National Geographic piece, because we have something called procedural memory. So if we always did it, we'll always do it the same way. For instance, I have a lot of residents that will read the paper, but I'm not sure they're actually reading it. It's just that habit of, I've always gotten the Baltimore Sun for, 25 years. So I'm still looking at it and I'm looking at the headlines, and we'll have somebody say, well, I already got my paper. I have it in my room, but it's the paper from yesterday. So I would largely say it's summed up to where his cognitive decline has gotten him to. He might be identifying with the magazine title, but thinking it's just the same one, because maybe in all essence, when he's looking at that magazine, he's not processing it fully like you might think he would have 6 years ago. And so he's just leafing through it maybe. So to him, I just read it might be he just saw the top cover or the title of it. If you still benefit from the magazine, maybe there's a time, like if he's feeling like he's read the same ones over, that you collect it and you put it in a place that's just for you, so that it's not making him feel like, why are we still getting this? If he's still benefiting, certainly you want him to be able to look at it, but that's probably the behavior of where that's coming from. The title is probably what's catching his eye. And so he's thinking it's the same title over and over and over again. We see that quite a bit. I already got my Baltimore Sun, but it was yesterday's Baltimore Sun.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you.
Greg Robb.
Hi, thanks Stacy for doing this. I really appreciate it, taking some time of your day. I guess my question is about, have you had experiences where families disagree about their loved one's condition? Because in my sense, it's somehow Quaker meetings are families, and they get a situation where they're concerned, some people are more concerned about an elderly member than others, and often and sides are taken. How do you bring people together to make it and have an honest discussion where, do you understand? Thank you.
Yeah.
Hard
I mean,
question.
absolutely. We see it all the time, all the time. And a lot of times I would actually sum it up to one word. A lot of times it can relate to the denial of certain individuals around their loved one's experience versus, somebody else accepting it. And everybody comes to that from different stages. Sometimes we'll see where like a family member that's more close to it, that's always around the person, kind of sees it more readily and is understanding of it. Whereas somebody who only sees them here and there may not like be as accepting of it, or it can be easy to kind of deny what's happening. Sometimes it could actually be the opposite, that I'm right in front of it every day, so I don't see it as much. Whereas my child who now saw me for the first time in 6 months is like, whoa, what is going on with mom? Like something has changed. I wish I had an easy answer on how to solve it. I mean, education is key, trying to educate about, and maybe taking some of what you learned today, that it's brain illness, and that changes are occurring. And think of it just like you would high blood pressure, and you would treat that. We have families though, from the minute that we have a loved one come into our residence till the minute that they leave us, the family can't agree. And as staff, we just try to continually re-educate. I would say to you all as your own persons, it's also important to share with your loved ones now kind of what your preferences are, and share a little bit about what's most important to you, because that can hopefully help your family. I don't think we do enough of that in our advanced directives. We talk about things like feeding tubes and whether you're going to resuscitate me. We don't talk enough about, well, if my memory changed, what is it that's most important to me? What is it that my family needs to know to understand that, like, I'm going to want this, or if at all possible, I'm going to want this. I don't think we talk enough about that in our advanced directives. There's not really a place for it, but I mean, at least informally talking to your family about what your experience is and what you would want and what you desire. Greg, the best thing I can offer is education, sitting down, and they may never agree. I think one of the most difficult cases we had a resident who wrote their advanced directives that 2/3 of her children had to agree for any decision, and the 2/3 could never agree. And largely I go back to that word I used, denial. It was a lot of denial around where mom truly was. And we struggled even as an organization for that, because we were doing everything we could for this individual, but it never seemed to be enough. And I think part of it is I'm going to use another word. It's not just denial, it's also grief. It's grieving the loss of the person that you knew the way you knew them prior to any brain changes. And so some people just can't see past that grief. I always use Nancy Reagan's quote, "It's a long goodbye." And for some families, they just can't accept that long goodbye. It's almost like they've either said goodbye already. We see that, or it's like they just wash their hands of it. Or we see where people just go into denial because they don't even want to think about all the changes that are happening. So education, that's the word I would use, education, and patience and understanding.
Thanks.
Betty Smallwood.
I want to ask you about my friend Susan. Susan and I have been, I'm not even sure I can quite formulate the question, but when you got to the middle stages, the tears were just running down my face. Susan and I have been very close friends since 3rd grade. And I've watched this. And it's complicated because she lives up in Boston where I used to live, and I would go back. I haven't lived there for quite a while, but I would visit regularly. Well, obviously, I haven't visited in a year and a half. And she doesn't call me anymore. And I don't want to bother her. And I feel she's irritated and she's not eating. She is living in an apartment now, and she has a caregiver. But she keeps saying, will you be my friend? Are you still my friend? I don't help.
Betty, that's really tough. I totally understand. And again, another toll of the pandemic, the distance of time, because unfortunately, if she already is in the middle stages, that distance only kind of grows some changes for her too, in terms of the relationship. Some things I would suggest, especially because you have the wonderful ability of being her friend from the 3rd grade, which is a long-term memory that she would retain. I would say if you do get the opportunity to speak with her, or even if you write her a letter, whatever way you're communicating with her, speak about those old times, because she's going to be far more likely to retain that information. Speak about your 3rd grade experiences, your teenage experiences, maybe, if there is memory there, your experiences growing up in your, marriages or your family life or whatever that was, more than maybe owning like maybe what's happened in the past year or what she's doing today, because she may not be able to do that. But you have that value in being such longstanding friends that tapping into those long-term memories I talked about and trying to connect that way. I don't know if it's possible for her caregiver to maybe do like a Zoom call with you two. We do those for our residents to keep them connected, because then they see a face, not just hear. See if they can do a FaceTime, a Zoom call, because she's seeing your face then. And even better, like if for some reason she doesn't recognize you as Betty today, like right now, Patricia Lenoy, and Patricia, forgive me if I said your name wrong. Patricia has a photo up instead of her actual like talking, even if like there's an older picture of you two that you can put as your picture and then stop your video, that might connect with her because she sees it as the two of you together. So really tying into those long-term memories with her, and maybe write her a letter. If communicating right now verbally is too much, write her a letter. And then maybe her caregiver could help her to write a letter back to you. We have a couple of residents that have kind of become pen pals with their friends again, because, it's a way that they can communicate, and it's a little easier for the person who doesn't have the verbal language like they once did. That's what I would suggest. But tapping into those long-term memories that you share together, because you have that great benefit of not being a friend from 2 minutes ago. You're friends for all these years.
What about this loss of weight? I mean, I keep saying to her, I have a little extra weight. I'll be glad to give you some of my.
It does happen in dementia, unfortunately, whether it's forgetting to eat. I would hope that if she has a caregiver that they're supporting that process. Our sense of taste also changes through our dementia journey. Little known fact for you all, but your sense of sweet is the last to go. We actually sometimes stimulate appetite with sweet, whether it's a Coke, to stimulate that sweetness and then get them eating their food. We even advocate sometimes for a bite of ice cream to like get their mouth going, and then like they'll start to stimulate their appetite. Sometimes you have to be less stringent about what's good for you versus what somebody is willing to eat. Because we can all say, oh, we'll give them an Ensure. It's not the best thing ever, but if I will eat ice cream or I will eat a cookie, sometimes like encouraging foods of pleasure, because our sensory experience as we have dementia develop or progress actually increases. So we look for those sensory experiences as our ability to verbally connect and connect in other ways change. We're looking for how our environment's going to basically feed our soul. So for some people with dementia, one of the things that actually meets the greatest need is food, because it still speaks to their senses when verbal language isn't speaking to them anymore. So I would encourage them to encourage the food she likes and maybe encourage sweet to stimulate her appetite.
Thank you very much.
These are great ideas. I see that we have 3 questions, and also that it's getting late. So if you can be brief and concise in your question, that would be help. And Bob Rudy is first.
Thank you, Meg, and thank you very much, Stacy. There's some of us on this meeting with you who are working with meetings sometimes when conflicts do come up, and maybe conflicts involving a person who's going through some changes like this. And a couple of specific things you mentioned, maybe if you feel like you're having problems with an onset of dementia, but you're not sure, you should go to a doctor. I'd question 1, what kind of doctor? I don't trust all doctors.
Okay.
In this area. 2, what kind of, I think I trust specialists sometimes. If it would be useful to have a consultant work with like a meeting that's having problems, what kind of, who could be helpful in this kind of area? So I'll just leave it at those two questions for now. I got involved in this field to a certain extent, particularly elder mediation. My mother in 1987 developed Alzheimer's. So for the next 4 years, she trained me a lot, and I found it a fascinating area to work in. So I'm sure you do as well. Those are my questions, Stacey, anyway.
Okay, thanks for the questions. Ultimately, and it depends on your trust level, Bob, because absolutely your trust level is different. Ultimately, I would err that a person should always start with their primary practitioner. However, remember that they're your practitioner, not the other way around. So, I would suggest that if you don't feel like they're following the proper steps to pursue it even further, that you always have that right to do that. We always recommend trained geriatricians who understand dementia and understand what that journey looks like. I will tell you, my experience has been every doctor handles it differently. Some doctors are what I kind of call a minimalist, meaning they'll have you leaving the door saying, well, it's dementia and it's going to progress and not much I can really tell you beyond that. Come see me again in a year. Arthur can attest to this. Some of Broadmead's programs are because we didn't want any longer an individual to walk out of a doctor's door and hear that they have dementia and be like, okay, good luck. See you later. We'll talk to you soon. We implemented programs that follow that person. So it's not just, they're not left alone. I would say from an assessment point of view, you would seek out a trained dementia specialist geriatrician. Places like Hopkins have those, Shepherd Pratt. Neurologists can certainly help with a lot of the diagnostic work that's to be done around dementia. Also neuropsychologists. Neuropsychologists are actually trained to be your cognitive expert in testing. And I go back to speech therapists are amazing. They do a lot of assessing in their work, things like the BCAT, which is the brief cognitive assessment tool. They do something else called the CLQ, a lot of fancy terms. But actually at Broadmead, one of our biggest reliances is on our speech therapists to talk to us about what they're seeing and what that person is experiencing right now and what they would expect next. But I would say starting with your primary, if you don't trust your primary, maybe finding a new primary. But I would also say if you have an internal primary that's not necessarily a trained geriatrician and you feel like you're experiencing some of these losses, then maybe you need to see the next step. And I would say if they tell you that you have dementia or that they think it's dementia and we'll see you again in a year, that's not a good enough answer. I would keep asking more questions and say that you would like to talk to somebody else about some more advanced diagnostics. Because you have the right to that. And what I say to most people, and actually I failed to point it out, but on all of my presentation slides, I had a little picture of snowflakes. That was purposely done because if you've met one person with dementia, you've met one person. Bob, you and I could be at the same exact stage of dementia, but because of where it's affecting our brain, like what parts, who we are, our life makeup, our care partner establishment, our environment, we're going to look very different. We could be exactly at the same stage and look very different. So no clinician should just treat you like a diagnosis on paper and say, okay, have a good day. They should be helping you to look at what's next and how do they best help you. Some people don't want all those diagnostics. They say, okay, well, it's dementia. And what I would say as a practitioner is I'm going to treat you, Bob, based on the symptoms in front of me. It's not so much about whether you had Alzheimer's or you had Lewy body. It's the symptoms in front of me and what support you need. That's how I'm going to treat you. But for families and for people going through this journey, they want answers. They want to know what this journey is going to look like for them. And just leaving with a, hey, you have dementia, see you later. That's not what we want. So a trained geriatrician, your primary who's going to work with you to explore further steps for evaluation, that's what you need.
Rich Liversidge.
Thank you. My question really is a follow-on to this presentation. Here at Friend's House, I can see something like this would be really, really valuable, perhaps for the Sandy Spring meeting generally. And I'm wondering, is this something that you're able to take on the roads? Can you do a presentation elsewhere? And how do we set something like that up?
Yes, absolutely, Rich. I don't know if maybe Meg can get you my information, but absolutely. Part of what we do as part of our center work at Broadmead is education for professionals, for caregivers, for anyone that needs it. I built this education today just for you based on what I knew your needs were, and I would do the same for any organization that asks. Yes, absolutely, would love to do it. So please just reach out. Depending on the needs, we could either do in person, depending on where status lies on a given day, or we could do it this way, whatever meets your needs.
Great.
And I want to let all of you know that this presentation has been recorded and will be edited slightly so that it doesn't have some gaps in it, but then will be posted on the yearly meeting website by this Friday's announcements. So you can, it will tell you that it has been posted to the yearly meeting website, and you will get a link to where you can link to it, and that's where it will stay so that you could use it in a group as well.
Great. I didn't realize it was being recorded, but because I didn't see it show up, but I guess that's just because of the way it shows up on my screen. Thank you.
Yes, well, and we knew that there were people that need to be able to see it and want to be able to see it, but wouldn't be able to see it today. And also members of local meetings that may wish to, but I think there's also the real advantage to having Stacy set up something that's particular to what you need. So feel free to do that. And I will tell you that the price that we paid for this was very modest, and I would not think that it would be difficult for other groups to have their own particular presentation as well. And I see that Pat Schenk or Ted Rowley have a question. Do you have time for another one, Stacy?
I can do one more. Yep, absolutely.
Thank you.
Is caffeine helpful in terms of memory issues?
That's one of those areas that they've done a lot of research on. Thanks for that question, Pat. They've done a lot of research on. They haven't had a lot of results. Like I know myself, having personal experience with ADHD in my family, like they actually say caffeine can help support the needs in that. There hasn't been a large amount of research. I know that there were some researchers that were looking to do some studies around coffee in particular, and dementia care. But there's been no real like significant findings when it comes to caffeine use. Actually, sometimes the concern can be quite the opposite, especially because there's sleep disturbances and other challenges that come with dementia. So sometimes it's quite the opposite, that we worry about caffeine use, in part because of some of the symptoms that develop in dementia care, like sleep disturbances. But that's a great question.
Patty Nesbitt?
Oh, Patty, we can't hear you. Oh, yeah. Can others hear Patty? I can't hear her.
No, I can't either. And I know that the internet is not very good at her house, so.
Patty, I don't know if you can put it in the chat real quick.
We can't hear you at all, Patty.
Okay. Patty, if you can hear me, maybe ask through Meg, and Meg can put me in touch with you. I'd be happy to answer whatever your question is.
Sure. Well, thank you very much, Stacy. This has been a very interesting, very helpful presentation. And I'm sure that you're going to get appreciated by many more people than you saw today as well.
Well, thank you all so much. Just remember, we're always a resource for you. And just remember, I challenge all of you, like I just said to Bob's question, if you're experiencing challenges, be the steerer of your own ship, make sure you're getting the assistance you need. And I challenge you, when you're working with friends, if I can use 3 words, it's education, patience, and flexibility.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And you're getting chat thank yous from many people and lots of happy hands. So we appreciate it.
Thank you all. Thanks for the time.
Thank you.